All right, everybody, welcome back. You are listening to Into the Cauldron. I'm Chris. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm here today with a really incredible guest, someone I have been waiting to talk to for a really long time, Matthias Castle, who is, in his forthcoming book, really one of the foremost English translators of the Ars Notoria, and really a lot of the texts of the Ars Notoria tradition, because as we're going to get into today, the Ars Notoria is not just one single text, it is a tradition, really. It is even arguably the earliest manuscript of the Solomonic tradition. And we are going to get into all of that. So I'm really excited to really hand this over to Matthias, where we're going to have a wonderful discussion about the Ars Notoria, whether it's in terms of practitioners of the Ars Notoria in medieval magic, or just the textual history of all of that kind of thing. So Matthias, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Brilliant. So for people who don't know, I said there, you have a book coming out with Inner Traditions. I've heard some conflicting reports about the date that it's coming out. I heard at one point it was December, then I heard November. Now I'm hearing February.
Yeah,
so I'm not sure.
No, it's November the 28th.
November. Okay, November 20th. Okay, brilliant. So it's coming out fairly soon.
Yeah, in a month.
Yeah, about a month time. Okay, cool. So for people who, I guess, don't know you yet, or of course they will eventually with this book, but for people who don't know you at the moment, can you, I guess if we open this up a little bit, can you talk a little bit about, I guess, your background in your studies and how you came to focus on the Ars Notoria out of all the other kind of grimoire texts that we have throughout the medieval period?
Yeah, I have a bachelor's in religious studies and philosophy from Emory Henry College, and I came to study the Ars Notoria by looking at Robert Turner's English translation, finding some problems with it, and then tracking down the original through the work of Veronese, his work, which is his critical edition here.
That's the Latin critical edition, isn't it?
2007, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I just worked on the translation and did some original research of my own.
Brilliant. Yeah. So I mean, out of all the, when we look at medieval Europe, I guess essentially, there are so many other grimoires, even in the Solomonic tradition in general, right? So what was it about the Notoria, or I guess about Turner, that attracted you to it originally? Why the Notoria, I guess?
Well, why I got into it because I was interested in tracking down the ritual, trying to understand how it was set out, if you're to do it step by step.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I found some problems with the text, and realizing that it was disorganized and corrupted, and that's why I tracked down the original 13th century text.
Right. So I guess this is one of the things that we can start to open up a little bit more. One of the big misconceptions I think people probably have is they will approach the Ars Notoria. Probably they may have heard of it through versions that are included in the Magicae that usually are building off of Robert Turner's. I think it's 1657, something like that, 1650s.
Yes.
That's his translation. Yeah. Most people will have experienced the Notoria sort of through Turner's work that is sometimes included in the Magicae, but it presents this image that the Notoria is kind of one single text, but actually it's not. It's a textual tradition, really.
Correct. Yeah, the Ars Notoria has it spawned a number of derivative texts, and I translated a few of them. The one that some people may be familiar with is John de Morigny, his Liber Flororum, which was done in Latin. Critical edition from Fenger and Watson. But there is the Ars Brevis, there's the Opera Omnia, there is the Ars Paulina, and there is one by abbreviated text by Thomas of Toledo.
And I assume most of those texts are working off of a kind of a similar manuscript source when we go further and further back, which I think would be maybe what Ars Notoria A or A2. I think that's like A2 and B.
So there are Veronese established a version A, a version A2, and a version B in his study of the manuscripts. There's about 50 some of these manuscripts that exist, and he classified them in those three categories, primarily A and B, and then he has those Latin critical editions in his work, and I translated from that work. So I have a version A, which is a short version, and a version B, which is the long version with glosses and commentary.
Right. So is that sort of the main way in which the versions differ then? So version B is a longer version that has kind of critical commentary and things on it, or do they have different notai in them?
There's for the generally speaking, the figures are the same. The notai is what they're called in the book, but generally the same. But there are some slight differences between A and B with the figures.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, I guess, if we're, going down this huge rabbit hole, I guess, let's talk about, I guess, the textual history of the Ars Notoria. You sent me before this a very wonderful, I guess we say flowchart that was outlining kind of all the influences on all the different texts, and I'll flash this up on the screen now as we're speaking, so people can kind of follow along. But if we want to begin, if we say let's begin with Robert Turner's, like what you did, and then working our way back, that kind of thing. How do we sort of trace the evolution of this tradition? Because it is a huge thing. I mean, I in my mind, the question I'm kind of asking is, where did this kind of magic come from, or where did this tradition come from? And I think it would probably be very, very useful for people if we start to unpack, I guess, some of the influences and some of the orders that the texts evolved in. If we start with Turner. Okay,
so Turner, he translated the Latin text that was found in the Opera Omnia, or the collected works that are attributed to Henry Cornelius Agrippa. Now, Agrippa did not write this Latin text, but it was just included amongst his other works. And so Robert Turner translated from that. Now, like I said, there was some imperfections with that Latin text. Now, that Latin text shows influence from the Ars Brevis, which is one of the derivative texts of the Ars Notoria. And then it is also the Agrippian text, as I like to call it, also has a strong influence of the version B, or the glossed version of the Ars Notoria. Mm-hmm. And actually, so these two texts are actually put together, excuse me, in the Agrippa's collection. So you have the Ars Notoria version B and the Ars Brevis. And so when you read Turner's translation, it starts off with version B, and then it goes to the Ars Brevis. And there's some special material that's kind of smashed in between the two. I'll probably write a little bit about that on my blog in the near future. But for the most part in my book, I don't discuss Turner's work to much extent. I focus really on the translation of these derivative texts in the Ars Notoria itself, version A and version B.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. So how do I guess, because they're directly influencing all the way down to Turner, essentially. So with things like the Ars Brevis and maybe the Agrippa's opera, do they also contain notai, or are they kind of like smushed in between? Are they kind of sandwiched in between other things?
Yeah. So in the Latin edition of Agrippa's text, and in the Robert Turner translation, you just have one figure, which I call the Agla figure, which is called the figure of memory. And that is a part of the Ars Brevis, or the short art. And none of the original notai of the Ars Notoria is found in the Latin edition or Robert Turner's edition.
Interesting. So are there? How did these? Do we know how these things kind of got lost? Essentially, is that kind of what happened? Did they just kind of get lost in translation as copyists were copying manuscripts and things like that? Or
it's not very clear on how that occurred. Why the figures got lost? There are additional figures even from the short art, the Ars Brevis, that were excluded from the Latin Agrippan text and the Robert Turner translation.
Right.
Why that is, I don't know. My personal hypothesis is that the original Latin scribe of the Agrippan text started with the Ars Brevis when he was doing his composition, and then added the version B to it, but never included the figures.
Right. And the version B, if I'm remembering your flowchart, I think version B, its sort of most direct influence is the A2 stream, right, of the Ars Notoria. It sort of comes via that.
The A2 goes influenced the version B. Yeah.
Okay. And then I guess the version A influenced A2, essentially.
Correct. So it's A to A2 to B.
Right. And then from this, I'm sort of looking at our flowchart here. There seems to be some, what you're implying is kind of lost prayers or figures that were kind of exerting some influence on either of them, or that it's not full or something.
So if we step back, you're looking at the Ars Notoria is, I would say, is a text that is based on the Flores Aurei, the golden flowers of Apollonius of Tyana, and that text was incomplete, and so we have a lost, some prayers that are lost, and some figures, primarily from the sciences that are associated with the prayers and figures. And so the Ars Notoria becomes it accumulates or acquires these other fragmented texts. And so one of them is the Ars Nova, or the New Art, and that was the first derivative text of the golden flowers of Apollonius. And then there's these 9 prayers or Novum Termini that were added, and then along with the text got rearranged, and the figures were no longer in the text, but then pushed to the very end of the text. So there was definitely a lot of rearranging going on between whatever the original golden flowers was to version A, and then there's some more shuffling between A and A2, and you have another section of the special prayers. So let me back up a little bit. So in the Ars Notoria, or the golden flowers, you have 2 groups of prayers. You have the general prayers and you have the special prayers. And so where it got fragmented was when it got talking about the prayers of philosophy, and we lose those science, some of those science prayers and some of the figures. And we have this later addendum about the special prayers. So obviously text got rearranged, and then the figures themselves, instead of being incorporated into the body of the text, they were pushed to the very end of the text.
Interesting.
And so
I guess does that display that someone was reading it and maybe didn't understand what the figures were for, or?
I think the reason why they pushed them to the end is because there was getting to be some confusion on which prayers were attributed to which figures.
Right.
Yeah. So part of the Ars Notoria is you do your prayer, and if you're wanting to learn knowledge about grammar, you do the prayer and then you inspect the figure associated with it. And so you would do that through the religious practice and the art of memory to learn your subject matter.
Right. And I suppose because in the flowchart here, we distinguish, I guess, between mythical and material origins. So with the Flores Aurei, as far as I remember, I think isn't the Flores Aurei the earliest manuscript that we have, I guess, materially as well, though, because I think isn't there a copy of it in I think it's Yale, isn't it, the Yale library?
Yeah. So the Yale manuscript is dated 1225. they're just using the incipit, and then they call it the golden flowers of Apollonius.
Right.
But when you really look at the text, what we call the Ars Notoria is not just the golden flowers, but these other fragmented supplements, including the new art, these 9 prayers, and then this new arrangement of the special prayers, and then the figures at the end. So you have the Ars Notoria as this whole complete text, and what we would call the version A, or the short version of the text. So if we think about what might have come before, there might have been an original full complete text of the golden flowers of Apollonius. Maybe it was written in Greek. I tend to believe it may have been, but
Makes sense. Yeah.
There's some possible hints that it is, but there's not a lot of strong evidence for that. But that original text was used, and someone probably cut out the pages for the sciences and prayers and figures, and it got rehashed. I also believe that there was these supplemental texts might have been composed by a certain Christian writer who had written a letter, and we have a portion of that letter because it says that it addresses some of the questions that his addressee was asking him about the Ars Notoria, or the golden flowers. And so he answers that with this new art, and then his own personal recommendations on how to proceed with the ritual.
And which Christian writer was that? Sorry.
It's an unknown.
It's unknown.
We don't have the opening of the letter. We don't have the closing of the letter. But I point out in my book that there are some hints in which it says it addresses you, the addressee. I'm answering your questions and that kind of thing.
Right.
The hypothetical source that I believe that contains these fragments that we have.
Right, and then I guess I'm sort of following the flowchart again here, but the active source for, I guess, the Flores Aurei, so sort of Apollonius's one is kind of arguably maybe a Solomonic text, or at least in the mythic realm of things. I think because the sort of the folkloric textual tradition around the Notoria is that the notary art, I guess, is given to Solomon by way of, I think is it Pamphilius or Pamphilius the angel, something like that, by right. God, and it forms part of the narrative of the Testament of Solomon as well.
Right. Yeah. The entire Ars Notoria is based off of the biblical account of King Solomon making a sacrifice on the mountain to God, and then having a dream at night of God, and God asks him, "What would you like?" And King Solomon asks for wisdom, and God was pleased with that and granted him that wisdom. So the Ars Notoria is based on this the idea of dreams and a vision of God, or a vision of angels. And so the Ars Notoria practitioner is, in a sense, trying to recreate that by finding an angel that would teach them through dreams. And so when King Solomon received these writings from the angel, he had learned a method called the notarikon, or this Cabalistic method or exegetical method of extracting esoteric significance from the Torah and different writings. And so these prayers that the angel gave him, he constructed his own prayers using different languages: Hebrew, Greek, Chaldean, and so that became, when he compiled it all together, that became his Liber Florum, his book of flowers of heavenly teaching.
Hmm.
And then that was then passed on to Apollonius of Tyana, supposedly. And Apollonius had provided commentary on that text, and then he also provided the Latin prologues, or what would kind of be like a sort of translation or summary of these notarikon constructed prayers that Solomon had made.
That's really interesting, because I guess we don't it almost implies that there is, especially when we're looking at, I guess, the Torah and any of that kind of influence. It seems like there may have been a Kabbalistic influence on the Ars Notoria in some way as well.
The only Kabbalistic influence I see is this exegetical method called the notarikon, in
Right.
which you would there's two methods of that, a protracted method and a contracted method, in which you take like a line of text, like say out of the Torah, and you would say, okay, I'm going to just take the first letter of each word in this sentence and then contract that into a single word. And then you could do a vice versa, where you can take a word and then expand it into a sentence.
Right. Okay.
And so that is the only Kabbalistic or old Judaic tradition of interpreting text.
Right.
So if you think of yourself as like King Solomon, oh, I had this amazing dream from God. How do I interpret this? Let me go to the rabbis, and they would say, oh, well, let's interpret it this way. Let's look at the scripture and do this exegetical method and find out the significance of your dream.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense, because I guess like one of my next questions was really, I guess, how unique is the Ars Notoria in terms of sort of the landscape of medieval magic? I guess how unique it is a grimoire, because the only one I can kind of think of that has any kind of similarity in structure or I guess methodology with the Ars Notoria is something like the Sacra literature, right? So the Prince of the Torah literature, where the angel kind of comes down and you gain and sort of gives you immediate knowledge of
right,
or whatever. That's the only one I can think of that's kind of similar to the idea of the Notoria. I was kind of asking that Kabbalistic influence.
Yeah. That is, I mean, there's parallels with that, but I don't see necessarily a direct influence of that text on the Ars Notoria. And of course, in that same vein, we have Pseudo Dionysius, and his work has some parallels or influence on the Ars Notoria. But that was a very popular text in the medieval period, so it's not too surprising. Now, Apollonius of Tyana, he had several astrological magic texts attributed to him, and a lot of those texts were in Greek, and which kind of was one of the things that leads me to think that maybe the Golden Flowers, Flores Aurei, was originally a Greek text, because it would fit in that tradition. And also knowing what the Latin world knew about Apollonius of Tyana was very scant, and what knowledge there was, it was usually a negative viewpoint of him. So this also kind of leads me to think that perhaps it was the Arabs who transmitted the Flores Aurei to the Latin West.
Oh, interesting. So
that's just
through,
theory.
The theory, but it could, so in theory, it could have come through, I guess, the same vein of things, the same vein of texts that comes off after the fall of Toledo, which is like the same milieu that we get things like Picatrix in, right? So that transfer of Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew texts across sort of to the Latin West, whereas all the 10th, 11th century, it could potentially come along with those.
Right. Yeah. And so there's in the Ars Notoria, they talk about learning some of these arts of divination, like palmistry, or what's called chiromancy, geomancy, and a lot of these these references are texts that were, again, those we know were definitely geomancy was transmitted via the Arabs to the Latin West. So there's definitely a hint that all this is coming from the East.
It's in the same milieu, yeah, and it would make sense, I guess, because we do have other Greek texts that come along with those Arabic texts. But I mean, the Arabs do, like, there is a very strong tradition in Arabic of Apollonius. I think he's known in Arabic as Belinus, right? And he is attributed to a lot of alchemical works, I think, in the Arab or Islamic world as well. So the tradition about Apollonius as a kind of a wisdom figure or an author of magical text is quite strong in the Arab world as well. So it would make sense.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it makes sense. So I guess moving on the other side of things now. So if we start moving down the chain of the flow chart, I guess we can say, the next, I guess the next sort of main point when we get to the Notoria B is, I guess, John of Morigny and something like the Summa Sacrae Magica, for example. And I'm curious what this kind of connecting line is between the Summa Sacrae and the Flores Aurei as well, because I guess the immediate influence would be the Ars Notoria B, but there's a connecting line there between the Flores Aurei and the Summa Sacrae.
Oh, yeah. So again, this is hypothetical. Okay.
Okay.
From the section that I transcribed and translated on the Summa Sacrae Magicae, there's a hint that this is an older tradition, that it's referring to an older tradition. It has a collection of, I believe it's 20 prayers or 30 prayers. But I think it mentioned a total of 30 prayers. 20 of them are in the Ars Notoria, which is classified as part of the general prayers. And then there's 10 other prayers, one of which got lost and became the 9 prayers of the Novum Termini that exist in the Ars Notoria. And what is interesting about the Summa Sacrae Magicae is it includes these signa or signs or descriptive titles for the general prayers, or excuse me, these 20 prayers. And it explains their ritual purpose and function. And we don't get that in the Ars Notoria.
Right.
There you see, like I said, is in the Ars Notoria, you have this division of general prayers and special prayers. And the Summa Sacrae doesn't really even acknowledge that division. It doesn't contain any of the special prayers either, that I'm aware of. So there's definitely this hint that these prayers were used originally for perhaps another viewpoint on how to attain knowledge. You know, it wasn't this, you follow these special prayers to gain the knowledge of the 7 liberal arts, you know.
Right. So so are we saying it could, like, would it still be part of the Notoria tradition, or would it be a kind of a separate tradition of knowledge acquisition?
That is an excellent question. You know, people are still researching and translating the Summa Sacrae Magicae. So
right. I'm going to say it's a new thing. It is a bit of a new.
It's very new. So there's a lot of questions and there's still a lot of work to be done. Like I said, I've done a partial translation of the material that relates to the Notary Art, the Ars Notoria. So like I said, what's most interesting to me is the insight that these prayers have these signs or these descriptions on their ritual function. And it really seems to match up pretty well with what's in the Ars Notoria, from my viewpoint. If you look at the general prayers, they actually are subdivided into 2 parts. The first, the general prayers, I believe I want to say 1 through 4. The first 4 have to do with attaining the memory, the understanding, and the eloquence, and then the stability of those 3. That is preparing your mental faculties to I guess, be receptive to gaining knowledge. And then the second part of the general prayers are what the Ars Notoria says has to do with concerns with theology. And I really understand this when you look at the descriptions in the Summa, Sacra, and Magicae. You really kind of understand this attaining of theology as a practical theology. Like, it's really about attaining your ability to communicate with the angels, attaining these spiritual faculties, so you can communicate with them when you have your dream and your vision with them, and so you can receive the knowledge that the angel is going to give you. And then the angel is also going to give you these notaries, which fits in with again my theory that it is based off of the exegetical method of the notarikon, which you take these letters, and maybe they're Hebrew letters or Greek letters, and you extract the esoteric significance of these letters, and maybe they have it forms a sentence or a phrase, or is some sort of instruction on how to proceed with the Ars Notoria ritual.
Right, because I think that's like the sort of the preparatory or purification period. I think because you have, what I remember when I studied it myself, you have sort of that 15-day purification period where you sort of supplicate the angel for the dream, and then the angel kind of tells you whether you can continue, right? And you have the whole thing with saffron tea and putting the names on I think it's like laurel leaves or something like that, and then you dissolve them in water.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's a preparatory stage in the ritual, and then there's the ritual proper. And in order to proceed to the ritual proper, you have to gain permission from the angel to do so.
Is there any sort of indication of who the angel is? Because I know in the folklore tradition, it's was it Pamphilius or Pamphilius, right? Is it the same angel, or is it just an unnamed angel?
It's not clear. However, there does seem to be some indication that the Ars Notoria magic is governed by 4 angels. There's a little warning in the text about not abusing or profaning the notary art, which King Solomon, his servant got drunk and was looking through the notary art, and he became punished by the 4 angels, in which he lost his sight, lost his hearing. And so these 4 angels had punished him up to his death. And at the moment of his death, he revealed this to King Solomon, that he was punished for profaning the notary art. And so it's a warning to our readers, our practitioners, don't profane the art.
Yeah, so take the steps as they will. Make sure you get permission from the angel and so on. I mean, do we have because a lot of my research is in the Greek magical papyri and sort of demotic ritual manuals for the most part, and it does sound like that the whole idea of sort of inscribing names or like angelic names onto laurel leaves or something, and then dissolving.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Like there are similarities and things in the Greek magical papyri, and I think also I can think of a couple of Arabic traditions and things as well where they're burning or distilling like date inks or like myrrh inks or whatever, and putting them and dissolving them in certain things, right? So do we know where that kind of tradition came from, or is it a give and a take with that kind of thing? But
your guess is probably good as mine on that. We do see those parallels in the Greek magical papyri and the Arabic traditions. So we don't know. Again, I think what I would say is, going back to what we had said previously, that some of these texts were transmitted from the Arabs to the Latin West. Right. It certainly seems reasonable to think that some of their ritual practices would do so.
The methods and things would have come as well. So on that note, then, what do we know, I guess, about the people who were practicing the Notoria back in the day. Because I mean, especially it's clearly associated, at least when it gets to, I guess, the Latin West in sort of 13th to 15th centuries. It's very clearly sort of fitted into sort of the university curriculum and the knowledge of the liberal arts. So we can assume it's probably university students who are the active or most active practitioners of it. I mean, I think Trithemius has a copy in his library around, I think, 1500, but for the most part, I think if we were to kind of try and paint a picture of who was actually practicing the Notoria back in the day, it's probably like a medieval university student or something, right?
Right. Julian Veronese believes that it was probably practiced at the University of Bologna, and I tend to agree with him. I believe he had mentioned, and I can't remember if I include this in my book or not, but there was even talk of rumors among students and teachers about who was using the notary art. And this, teacher was saying how, this, I guess the teacher was like, if I recall correctly, he was like, well, yeah, the students are practicing that, but I'm not going to like condemn it or praise it or acknowledge it. I'm just going to ignore it and continue to teach what I teach. So there's definitely a story of a rumor there. But yeah, it was probably used by university students because, having a good education was going to, advance you in society. So one other thing that's kind of interesting about the University of Bologna is that they had a special department called rhetoric, and it developed into letter writing, which also has a collection of texts called the Notary Art, which is the legal profession. Okay, so we're talking about like the notaries that we have today. Right, they sign and stamp things, and so you have probably some thoughts of people relating the notary art to that department, perhaps. There's other perspectives on the notary art that maybe, like I said, we had talked about the Cabalistic method, the notarikon. You had the legal profession, and then also, if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, some of what he talks about certainly kind of parallels with the Judaic notarikon in terms of analyzing language, particularly the prayers and how they were composed. The Ars Notoria itself makes references to these Aristotelian terms, and you're thinking about what they call the intention and remission of forms, or these accidental forms, and looking at the language, like if you compound these words together or these prefixes, you have more intense intensity of the quality of the thing, or more packing of information into this word. So we're contracting this information into a single word. And then you can do vice versa, like I was talking about earlier, about taking the sentence taking the word, expanding it to a sentence, or vice versa. So you have the sum up. You're looking at the notary profession, the Aristotelian philosophy, and then you're looking at the Cabalistic exegetical method. So you have these different perspectives on how people at that time could have been viewing this book called the Ars Notoria.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it makes complete sense. I think it's interesting as well. The other kind of university that's coming to my mind right now that mentions it, I think the University of Paris actually deliberately mentions it in its condemnation of sorcery. Yeah, I think it's late 1300s, I think it's like 1390s. In the list that it publishes of like the illicit arts, it actually includes the Ars Notoria out of the University of Paris. So it's clearly also being, well, they were, in the very least, they were familiar with it. So clearly someone was probably practicing it around there as well. So, and then, it's kind of, that also that's it's quite an avant-garde place, right? Like it's where like Thomas Aquinas teaches, and I think Albertus Magnus as well. So that, again, almost every like tradition that the Notoria appears in, there are so many figures that are contributing different perspectives to all of it. So it kind of makes it this just expansive text, essentially.
Yeah, I believe as Thomas Aquinas was the first to condemn the book, associating it with magic and demons, and then it was just successively condemned thereafter by other figureheads, certainly church authorities.
So that itself is really interesting, because like on the surface of it, it's it's a ritual, or it's a collection of texts that's invoking angels towards a vision, or sort of the beatific vision, right? So the vision of God. So how do we get from traditions where they're using it arguably in theology, right? As you said, practical theology to gain knowledge of God. How do we get from a text like that that's working predominantly with angels to it being condemned as heretical and demonic? I mean, I know John of Morigny is very convinced that it is kind of it. I think the accusation Morigny levels at it is that like it's the biggest piece of heresy because it looks angelic, and this is kind of like how it tricks you. That the Notoria is like, it looks like the most holy book, but in fact it's not actually angels doing it; it's actually demons. And he has like all the he's famous for having all the terrible night terrors and visions and that kind of thing. But how do we get from sort of what is essentially a medieval manual of angel magic to people thinking it's demonic and condemning it?
That is a good question. I think what you said sums up the church position that yes, it looks very benign. It looks orthodox in nature, and it looks like a holy book, but actually there are demons behind this book, and you should stay away.
Yeah, because I seem to remember. I think I read this in Stephen Skinner, actually. I think it's in his version B translation, that he sort of notes that in the pictures of some of the notai, some of the sigils and the seals that we find are also sigils that are used for demonic kings in other manuscripts as well, in some capacity, or that they're used sort of in other matters that indicate demons. So it's not necessarily just angels included in the notai. There is also potentially some demonic influence as well. I don't know how you find that as well, or.
Oh, that's an interesting interpretation. When I look at the version B figures, they have these little squiggles, which for those who are familiar with grimoire magic, it looks like sigils that would be associated with certain spirits. My personal interpretation is that these squiggles are actually meant as markers for the art of memory. So you would these figures, if as I understand them, are used in the art of memory, in which you would mark the figures yourself. So I think these were very personal, like what we see in the manuscripts. It's just like the template, but an actual practitioner would take the figure, draw it themselves, and then as they're learning material, they would place a mark in the figure and be like, oh, that mark reminds me of something about grammar, because something about the alphabet, or something about syntax, or what have you.
Right.
And so I don't know if you want to go into talking about the steps of the art of memory and relationship to those figures.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll sort of moving, forward a little bit more here. If we unpack, the structure of the ritual, I suppose is a good way of looking at it. If we use the art of memory as the example point here, so how would, in theory, when we're following the text, what are kind of the instructions for unpacking the steps essentially towards the art of memory? I mean, we have the like the 15-day purification period, right? And then from there, moving forward, I guess, what are we looking at?
Oh, okay. So the Ars Notoria can be divided up into two kinds of rituals. One I call the greater ritual, which is basically the whole thing. And then a lesser rituals in which a single prayer is used within a particular context. Like you would pray to gain or persuade your boss or your leader, or something or to memorize something before you. And those were just very small contexts. If we talk about the greater ritual, you have, again, version A and version B. So if, version A is not very clear in its instructions, and I've had to reconstruct what that greater ritual looked like in version A. I believe it was 2 months to learn everything. It was like the 2 months are a template to learn something, whereas version B has been expanded to 4 months. And that is the one that you'll find in the other literature. But yeah, let me kind of pull out my notes because it's rather complex.
Cool. Yeah.
I won't go into everything, but
cool. just like a general overview or something would be, I think, helpful.
Yeah. With the version A, you want to really look at the divisions of time and the divisions of the prayers. So, like I said, it's 2 lunar months, and then each month is divided in half. Days 1 through 15 and 16 through 30. And then you also have special days, auspicious days, and ordinary days in which certain prayers are to be prayed. And then you also have these Egyptian days, or these unlucky days, which is the 15th, 17th, and 19th. And you should do certain things or avoid certain prayers at those times. And then the other division is the divisions of the prayers. Like I said, there is the general prayers, and then there's the special prayers. The general prayers can be divided up into 7 sequences, and that, as I mentioned before, there's the subdivision of those that are for mental, developing the mental faculties, and those that are developing the spiritual faculties to communicate with angels. And then the special prayers are those for assigned to the 7 level arts, or the forbidden arts of magic. So that would be, so in the first, so in the version A, you're looking at doing these prayers and also doing the inspection of the prayers.
And that's expecting the notai, right?
Inspecting, yeah, the notai. That's the technical term for the figures, yes.
Sure. And how sort of, I guess, how important are, sort of the other standard sort of magical operating procedures that we see in other grimoires here? Because one of the things that struck me with the Ars Notoria is that it's like the main sort of activity that you do as the practitioner is essentially prayer, right? It's prayer and also sort of inspection of the notai, so it's sort of scrying or gazing, essentially. There's not any mention really of planetary hours, planetary days, or like planetary incenses to burn like people would find in other Solomonic grimoires or anything like that. So, I mean, right. How consistent are sort of other magical technologies in the Ars Notoria as well? We see that, like, whether it's burning incense, making offerings, doing any of this other stuff, because that doesn't seem to appear.
It's very orthodox in nature. If you're looking at the ritual practices, you're looking at again acquiring a dream of a visitation of an angel who's going to teach you specifically how to proceed in the ritual. So there may be, even though we have the instructions here in the book, the angel may give you special direction. So dreaming, and then you're looking at prayers. And you're also looking at some advice on following the astrological prescriptions in which to best acquire certain fields of knowledge at certain times of the year.
Right. So I suppose you begin either the preparatory period, or you begin the inspection of the notai during the appropriate astrological season that's relevant to the discipline that you're learning, right? So like whether it's rhetoric or grammar or whatever, each of them is ruled by a certain zodiac sign, and you need to begin the ritual or begin inspecting the notai. Because I think if I'm correct, you don't do any inspection during the 15-day purification, right? I think the main inspection comes in sort of the 16 to 30 day, right? It's the latter half or the greater ritual, right?
So what you're talking about is the version B,
Right.
greater ritual. Okay, so that's what's out there in the current literature.
Mm-hmm.
No one has talked about the version A, what I just went through.
Right.
So if we talk about version B, it basically is trying to harmonize the ritual instructions from multiple sources into a whole. Okay.
Right.
So you've got two major ritual models. You got the Flores Aurei and the Ars Nova. Okay. And so there is a cost in harmonizing those two ritual models. One is you doubled your time frame. It goes to 4 months from 2. There are certain errors that are made, which there's a doubling of ritual instructions, inconsistent usage of the original ritual frameworks, and then it's a burden to the practitioner, because you got all these glosses and recapitulations of the material. And another thing, again, it goes back to the Flores Aurei as being in a fragmented state, which I had said. So there's problems with that, right? You're missing the astronomy and theology prayers and figures, and so that has been fixed by the version B scribed by or the Ars Nova, the new art scribe, by assigning these new prayers to astronomy and to theology. And so if we go looking at the version B ritual itself, the greater ritual, there are 5 main phases. The first phase you mentioned is the 15 days of penitence. The second phase, you have a special 3-day opening ritual procedure. This is the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday prep period, in which you're trying to acquire the permission of the angel to proceed with the ritual. And then there is this interim period, and that is to reconcile the calendar with the lunar month. Right. So because you want to start at the new moon with the ritual. And then you have the big part of the greater rituals, which is obtaining the new science, or the new art that you're trying to get. And that is your 4 months in the version B. Again, like I said, that's where the version B scribe has taken the 2 ritual models of the Flores Aurei and the Ars Nova together. And then the final phase, the 5th phase, is this 3-day closing ritual procedure, which is similar to the one that opened it. So that is your basic overall
basic
of version B. And of course, there's more to that. But yeah, you have your basic prep stage and then the ritual proper. And so in version B, what is unique about that from my reconstruction of version A, is version B is having you pray and pray and pray for this 3 months, and then at the very final month you inspect the figures. Whereas in my reconstruction of version A, you are praying and inspecting in both the first month and the second month.
Right, so you're sort of doing it right away. So is there no sort of 15-day purification period, or even like a 3-day purification period or anything?
There's nothing clear from the version A text. It may assume that you are doing some sort of spiritual
it
purification,
mention it, right?
but it doesn't say how long. No.
It's very interesting. Yeah, that's very,
But
very.
yeah, the 15 days themselves in the version B, again, that's a harmonizing of the different ritual models of how he came up with 15 days, and I talk about that in the book.
So I would assume that it's just kind of a. I mean, it does seem pretty standard. I mean, you have in other Solomonic grimoires, you have like 9-day purification periods or 7-day periods where you have to repeat the penitential psalms and that kind of thing. So, and even in the the Denotic ritual manuals, it's usually 3, 7, or 9 days for being abstinent and pure and all that kind of thing. So. It makes sense that they would kind of increase it, but 15 is also an interesting number as well. I don't know if there's like some numerology to the number, or if, as you said, it's just to bring the calendar back in line or anything like that.
Yeah. I believe. Let me see. Looking here at my notes, there's 12 days of ritual prep of confession and fasting and giving alms, and then you have the three days. Oh, so that's your Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So that's the part of the 3-day opening ritual, that's just my way of categorizing or making sense of the text. So I guess the 12 comes from, I think part of it comes from the new art, but yeah.
So one last, it's all fascinating to me, and it makes sense, I guess, when we're looking at how all of this has formed into I almost want to say a unified tradition, but it's not a unified tradition, probably the wrong word for it, because there are differences between the two. But I think I heard, I can't remember if we talked about this before on email or on Facebook or anything like that, but doesn't the Swan Book of Geratus also have influences from the Notoria prayers as well? So isn't the Notoria, I think version B, one of the sources for the Liber Geratus as well?
Correct. Yeah. So the writer for the Sworn Book of Honors is he's trying to fill in gaps. And so that gap, what was the missing prayers, are from these the Book of Three Souls, which has been translated now by Joseph Peterson, and he tracked it down. So that was just a substitute. So it's like, oh well, I got these. I need some prayers. Let's draw from the Notary Art. So that's what happened.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the notai in general and where the tradition of the notai comes from, because they're not necessarily like the closest analogy I guess you could think of in something else would be sigils, right? As you mentioned in other grimoires, that they are these kind of pictorial squiggles representations, but the notai are really something else entirely, right? They're usually they're a page big. They're these enormous kind of figures. So it's like, what are these things really? Where do they even come from?
Yeah, so actually a few of them come straight from textbooks. So one of them comes from Boethius's arithmetic book. You see it right there. It's just the figure is divided in half, but and that's associated with arithmetic and the Ars Notoria. And then the figures are really, I would, if you're thinking about them in terms of the art of memory, because the Ars Notoria calls itself, this book is also called the art of memory. So that's a very important to keep the central concept. And so these figures are like landscapes, is how I would imagine it. Because if you're applying the art of memory, the art of memory has 3 steps. You have imprinting stage, in which you take new information and you create an image for it, right? So, say you want to know your fruits or something like that. I don't know. I'm just coming up with something. Sure. So like, say you want to know or what fruits you're going to pick up from the grocery store. Apples, bananas, grapes. And so you would take your image and that you imprint it on your mind. And the ancients talked about writing on a wax tablet or stamping a seal like onto a letter. And so that's the imprinting stage. So once you've created your image, then you need a place to store your image. And so these figures are the storage area. Okay. And so the next step is doing a mental walkthrough. How are you going to retrieve your new information? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to place your images of the information along a certain route in the figure. And you always follow, in the art of memory, you always follow the same order, the same path. So you're doing this creative visualization of walking through the figure and being like, oh, I saw this image. It's going to remind me about my speech in my rhetoric class, the first part, the second part, the third part, the fourth part, until you go through the whole figure. And that's why I'm saying these figures are really meant to be customized by the practitioner. And so you see these little squiggles in the version B manuscript saying, oh, that squiggles to remind me about the thing I was going to talk about, the boat sailing down the river and this whole story about whatever and how it relates to my topic in rhetoric class or whatever. So.
Right. So it's kind of like, I guess what people often call the mind palace, right? So it's like creative visualization where you sort of, you visualize yourself in kind of a house with different rooms, whatever it is. And then like you put your, to use your example, like a shopping list in different rooms of the house. And then you kind of visualize yourself walking through different rooms and then it kind of triggers your memory of different things, right? That's really interesting.
Right.
Yeah. So it's always like, in a way, like even if you look at like anthropological accounts or anything like that, like that's also the way like Aboriginal Australians and a lot of indigenous cultures, their memory still works. They embody their memory in the landscape a lot of the time, like whether it's in certain trees or certain mountain ranges. And then when they are, walking through their landscape, essentially, the entire land is kind of like similar to a notai, right? The entire landscape is its own thing where they can see certain features in the landscape and that triggers memories. It's how they can remember, entire species of birds or entire plant life and varieties of herbs or like entire maps of an area in general. So that's really interesting, I guess. And then I guess on top of that as well, in the practitioner's mind, in their belief at least, they also have the assist. Like there is also a magical component in that the angel is also assisting with that at the same time. So there's a biological kind of memory component. But then in their belief, at least, there is the angel or the magic or I guess God or whatever is also helping them improve it.
Sure. Yeah. So in the ritual practice itself, you do the prayer and then you do your inspection and then you're also studying. It says the study at this time.
Right. You need to keep studying.
You take your textbook, you're creating the image and then putting it into the figure. And so, although the text doesn't say this, there is a sense that, that it may be assuming that you are also having dreams throughout this ritual procedure and getting further instructions on how to attain the knowledge that you seek.
Right, and then I suppose in theory, then the dreams are going to be the angels that are kind of giving you certain squiggles or certain symbols or certain preparations.
Or some of the letters that you would put into the figure.
Right, that you can then expand or contract, right? That makes sense. And then I guess as well, something I remember reading on your blog, actually, that I thought was really, really interesting. In that version B 15-day sort of preparatory period where you're brewing the saffron tea as well.
Oh, right.
The saffron tea and I think it's rose hip, isn't it, as well? Both of those also have memory enhancing qualities as well. They're both good for preserving memory, I think, right?
Yeah. The rose water and the saffron. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So not only are you doing the prayers and the creative visualization, you're also having an actual herbal tonic as well. That's kind of because like it's supposed to be hot, isn't it? It's basically kind of like a tea, essentially.
Right. It's a hot tea. Yeah. I did a little experiment with it. And I was like, wait a second, you have to heat this up. You can't just.
It's not going to work otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and those ingredients also come from the East, or from visiting,
I suppose
or the
saffron.
herbs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So,
really easy.
yeah, saffron's a very expensive spice.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, and especially even more so back in medieval times as well. Like it's expensive today for us. I mean, I guess even more so in medieval times before they had processing and everything as well. So
right.
it's interesting. And I mean, I know, like in my mind, I'm also thinking of like saffron is usually. I think it's Agrippa that assigns saffron to Jupiter. I think as well. So like there is, and rosewater is Venus. I think, which are. It's interesting that both of those in medieval astrology are the benefics, right? They're the benefic planets that are usually beneficial to everything they do. So, I mean, have you found not just in the tea or the substances, but I guess throughout the Notoria, have you found any kind of instances of like planetary or astrological influences outside of kind of the timing of choosing when to do the ritual? Is there any kind of planetary stuff in there?
Yeah, the interesting thing I was looking at was, okay, we have saffron, we got rosewater, and then we have these zodiac signs in which to learn certain fields of knowledge. And digging into the lore on that, I got the sense that the Ars Notoria is a very fiery of a fiery nature, because those signs, a lot of them are during the summer. And then you're taking in the saffron's a warming spice. So there's this, and then there's the mythology behind the laurel leaves too. You have Apollo, of the sun, and the laurel leaves being associated with divination, and also I read about how the laurel leaves and Apollo's energy is to push away the demons. So
that would make sense in the context of a purification as well.
Yeah.
I think if I'm recalling as well correctly, I think the Oracle at Delphi as well, so the Pythia, who was basically the priestess of Apollo, she used to chew laurel leaves as well when she went into trance and received her visions, I think, as well. So that's also interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah.
So I think it like all of it's kind of lining up. I'm like, yeah, this is like it's almost like a medieval dream manual, like for like triggering dreams or like increasing memory via dreams. It's kind of
absolutely. Yeah. So I think it follows that vein. If you look back to the ancient Greek, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so sort of ancient Greek and the sort of the Greco-Egyptian papyri and the demotic manuals, things like that. Because I think like we even have, in fact, I think actually associated with Apollo as well. Like one of the rituals that comes to mind for me, I think it's like divine evocation of Apollo. I think it is in the papyri. It instructs you to kind of basically draw caracteres or sigils on laurel leaves and make them into kind of like a crown and then wear it like, during the thing. It's like it's the same, even though you're not dissolving them in water, like that whole procedure of drawing sigils or characters or names onto laurel leaves and then putting it on your body in some capacity, like that's almost like a word for word like copy aside from the dissolving, essentially.
Yeah. The methods get passed down, transmit.
It's interesting. So brilliant. I guess the last thing I want to ask you, I know we didn't want to touch on John of Morigny too much, but the last thing I'll ask you before we kind of start wrapping up, what do you kind of make of John of Morigny's whole experience? Because for people who don't know, who are listening, John of Morigny is, I think, isn't it like 14th century Benedictine monk, I think? And he sort of has this whole experience with the Ars Notoria. He's one of the most famous people who arguably practice the Ars Notoria, and he kind of does the whole experience, and he starts doing the whole ritual, and he starts getting all of these terrible night terrors and visions, and he becomes convinced that it's demonic and all this kind of thing, that it's not actually angels, and it inspires him to kind of take the general procedure and sort of reconstruct it and sort of rework it into another sort of text that is designed for rapid learning, but it's more focused on the Virgin Mary, I think. But what do you kind of make of his whole experience? I mean, in general, like, is he drawing on anything from his experience, or does it kind of seem that he just kind of had a bit of a one-off thing? I was like, this is insane. I'm not doing this anymore.
um, yeah, I'm really not sure. Yeah, it could have been like, oh, I had this night terror, and I'm not going to touch that Ars Notoria ever again. I think that there's something that we can relate to ourselves today as people. It'd be like, oh my gosh, that was terrible. I'll never touch it again. But I feel that he believes he had genuine experiences of the Virgin Mary and being guided to rework his material, and he had his circle of followers that were interested in his work and what he was doing. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, because that is kind of the main difference, right? 'Cause I think the Liber Florum that he composes, like the main focus isn't so much angels; it is more sort of via like knowledge comes via the Virgin Mary, right? Because I mean, because
Right.
Mary or other kind of, I don't know, like other Christian figures, like they may, like, the names of Jesus or whatever may appear in passing in the prayers, but like other sort of major biblical characters, do they appear in the Notoria? I can't remember.
Other figures.
A bit like biblical
There's
figures like Jesus or Mary or anyone like that.
there's aside from King Solomon,
Mm.
you have prayers to the Holy Trinity. That comes up quite frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Jesus Christ is mentioned a time or two. Certainly made a reference to a prayer called "Light of the World,"
Mm-hmm.
uh, but I would say predominantly it's the Holy Spirit or the Trinity, um, or angels, generally speaking.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's also the whole tradition of sort of gaining knowledge from Mary seems to be a more of a John of Morigny thing.
Well, you have the Ars Brevis, the short art. It has it's very Catholic in nature. It references Virgin Mary. It addresses prayers to her, and this is what's interesting too that we didn't talk about is the Ars Brevis is, like I said, very Catholic in nature. Has these votive masses that you make. There's a ritual. I would call it like a crucifixion ritual, in which the practitioner identifies himself with Jesus as being crucified on the cross.
Interesting.
And the Ars Brevis was composed in the mid 14th century, and by the time it got to the Latin scribe who wrote, whose work got into the Agrippa Opera Omnia collection of works, you had the Protestant Reformation period, and so that those Catholic elements of the Ars Brevis was omitted by that Latin writer. And so by the time Turner translated it, he himself made very minor deletions of anything Catholic, but
Right.
most of that deletion was made by the Latin scribe of the Agrippian collection of works.
Yeah, because I mean, if the Ars Brevis is mostly Catholic, he must have omitted quite a bit. Like he must have like scraped the text.
Yeah. So what I had done with my edition of the Ars Brevis, Veronese had taken two manuscripts in Latin, and I took a third one that was from the 15th century, and it contains additional figures. So there's four figures in this third manuscript, Sloane 513. And so I've taken these two Latin editions and put them together into one. And so now we have those other Catholic prayers and this very more extended length of the Ars Brevis. And so I have that translated. What's also interesting, I wrote a blog about this, is that these figures, of the four, we're not quite sure of their identities and what they're associated with in terms of learning and acquiring memory and understanding and so forth. But there's still a lot of work yet to be done with the Ars Notoria tradition. So I hope that gets the ball rolling in that regard. Also, what I didn't mention, this is interesting, is there's this one prayer in the Ars Notoria that has circulated among the grimoires. It's found like in the Key of Solomon, and it is also in John Dee's work, which there's these 3 angel names that appear, and that prayer was found in the Ars Notoria originally, and then it was passed into the Ars Brevis, and then from the Ars Brevis it was passed into this Polish king's prayer book in the 15th century. And there that prayer gets recontextualized, is then used for doing crystal gazing or summoning spirits. And so from that, it goes into the greater grimoire tradition as being associated with crystal gazing or the summoning of or spirit conjugation.
Right. So let's talk about kind of like Trithemius's method of drawing spirits into crystals and things like that.
Right. Yeah. So
what was it originally in the Notory, and what was the prayer for? Is it like something for astrology or rhetoric or something?
No, it was. It had 2 occult virtues, which it would be used for what I call the lesser rituals in which particular context. One is for attaining a vision, and so this kind of makes sense that prayer would be used for spirit conjugation.
Yeah, sure.
And then in my hypothesized Christian writer of the letter, he talks about attaining a vision, attaining a spiritual experience with this prayer, and associates it with the medicine. And so attaining certain knowledge about someone's health, or if a woman is pregnant or what have you. And so it has those 2 ritual functions. What's also interesting is that the Summa Sacrae Magicae associates that prayer with visions and attaining communication with angels. So that's consistent with its use in the Polish king's prayer book.
Thing. Yeah. So how is this? Is it like the Polish one? Is this the one that's on the flowchart here, sort of directly descended from the Liber Forum and the Ars Brevis? I'm not even going to try and pronounce that.
Yes, that's the one.
Right. Okay, it makes more sense. Yeah. So then I guess the only other one on this list that we haven't talked about really is that other 15th century one, the De Ars Crucifixi. So where does that fit in? That comes from the Ars Brevis, right?
Yeah, that comes from the Ars Brevis.
So what is that text? Is it like a collection of prayers in a similar kind of way? Or?
There's still some research to be done on that one, but the relationship there is that, as I had mentioned, there's a crucifixion rite in the Ars Brevis in which the practitioner identifies with Jesus, the crucified Jesus, and so that exists in that 15th century text by the hermit. Mm-hmm.
That's really so. When you say identify with, like, is it kind of similar, like because the thing that's coming to my mind right now is it's a really common Egyptian formula, which is kind of the I am formula, where like the practitioner in the Demotic papyri quite frequently identifies with gods. Goes, I am Osiris, I am Anubis, I am such and I call you by my authority, essentially. So like there's this procedure of identifying with a god identify, I guess, your consciousness with the god is very well established in the demotic stuff. So are we looking at kind of a similar, like, what's the wording there when we say identifies with? Is it that he's becoming Jesus on the cross, or is it kind of sympathizing, or what?
Well, what the instructions are is that you take nails into your hands, and then you go up against your bedroom wall and extend your arms out as if you are crucified as Christ.
Interesting.
There's no invocation like you would find in the Greek magical papyri, saying I am this, I am that. It's just instructions to do that posture.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's very unique, I guess. I can't think of anything else that does that. Although I can see it being kind of like a sympathetic kind of magic or whatever that you're like emulating, so it helps you sort of get into the feel of it, I guess. But it makes sense. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess we can start. We can start wrapping up. So you said your book is out. I think you said November 20th. I think.
November 28th.
28th. Okay, my mistake. Yes, and it's with inner traditions, right?
Correct.
Right. Okay. Is there anything you want to share about it? I guess like this can be a nice like last minute section for you to plug anything. Like where can we find you? What can we expect? All that kind of thing.
Yeah. You can find me at MatthiasCastle.com. And I am continuing to work on future projects of an esoteric nature. So keep a lookout for that in the future.
Yeah, you have a blog as well, which I'll plug everything in the description below, so everyone can find you easily. Everything I can find, but yeah, I guess like we can wrap up then. It's a nice hour and a half, I guess. So Matthias, thank you so much for coming on. This has been incredible.
Oh, thank you for having me very much.
Yeah.